The first thing I noticed about the place wasn't the charming, slightly crooked porch or the climbing roses that threatened to swallow the western wall. It was the silence. A deep, resonant silence that felt less like an absence of noise and more like a presence in itself. It was the kind of quiet that made the city I'd left behind feel like a fever dream, a chaotic memory from someone else's life. I had come here, to this small cottage tucked away on the corner of a sprawling, old money estate, to find that quiet. I had craved it, yearned for it, imagined sinking into it like a warm bath. But in those first few weeks, the silence was just another form of loneliness, a mirror reflecting my own empty spaces back at me. My life had become a series of observations from behind glass. I'd watched the world through my bedroom window in the city, and now I watched it through the paned glass of the cottage living room. My routine was simple, monastic. I'd wake, make coffee, and sit at the small wooden desk I'd positioned to overlook the grounds. I was a graphic designer, a job that required little more than a laptop and a steady internet connection, allowing me to be a ghost in my own life. I could exist anywhere and nowhere, all at once. For days, the only person I saw was the groundskeeper. He moved with a kind of unhurried purpose that I found mesmerizing. I didn't know his name. He was just a shape in the distance at first, a figure of denim and faded cotton, his features obscured by the sun or the morning mist. He was the caretaker of this vast, manicured world that I was temporarily inhabiting. He mowed the endless lawns in straight, satisfying lines, the sound of the engine a low drone that was the only regular interruption to my silence. He pruned the roses with a careful, almost tender precision, his hands, even from 100 yards away, looking large and capable. I watched him the way one watches a nature documentary, fascinated by a creature perfectly adapted to its environment. He belonged here. I was just a tourist. I built a narrative for him in my head, a silent film I played on a loop. He was a man of few words, stoic and steady. He probably had a dog, a loyal mutt that followed him on his rounds. He probably drank his coffee black and woke with the sun. These were fictions, of course, flimsy constructs to fill the quiet, but they gave him a shape in my mind beyond just the groundskeeper. He became a character in my self-imposed isolation, the only other actor on my very small stage. He never looked toward my cottage. I was as much a part of the landscape to him as the old oak tree near the drive, and I was content with that. Or so I told myself. It was easier to be an observer. Less risk. The day it all changed started with a sky the color of a bruise. The air grew heavy, thick and electric, the kind of oppressive humidity that feels like a held breath. The birds went silent. I could smell the storm coming long before I heard it. A scent of damp earth, ozone, and something wild and green, as if the trees themselves were exhaling in anticipation. I stood on my small porch, a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hand, and watched the clouds boil on the horizon. The silence of the estate had been replaced by a new kind of quiet, a tense, waiting stillness. That's when I saw him. He was at the far end of the property, securing the heavy iron gate that led to the main road. He moved with that same deliberate economy I'd come to recognize, his shoulders broad under a worn gray t-shirt. Even from this distance, I could see the way the wind whipped at his clothes, pressing the fabric against his frame. He finished with the gate, latching a heavy chain, and then he turned. For the first time since I'd arrived, he looked directly at my cottage. Directly at me. My heart gave a stupid, childish little kick against my ribs. I felt caught, a voyeur exposed. I should have stepped back inside, but I was frozen, pinned by his gaze. He started walking toward me, his stride long and even, eating up the distance of the lawn. The wind was picking up now, rustling the leaves of the oak into a frantic whisper. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the stone path and the dry dirt, each one leaving a dark, spreading stain. He didn't hurry. He just kept coming. The sky ripped open with a low, guttural rumble of thunder that vibrated through the soles of my feet. The rain was coming down in earnest now, a sudden, violent sheet of water that blurred the world into a wash of gray and green. He was only a few yards from my porch when he finally stopped, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead and dripping from his chin. "You'll want to get inside," he said. His voice was exactly as I'd imagined it. Low, a little rough around the edges, like gravel settling. It carried easily over the growing roar of the downpour. I just nodded, unable to form a coherent word. He glanced past me, at the small, flimsy-looking awning over my porch, and then back at the deluge. A small shed, the one where he kept his tools and machinery, was about 20 feet away, its solid-looking wooden door slightly ajar. It was a much more substantial structure than my decorative porch roof. He took another step closer, now standing at the edge of the stone steps leading up to my porch. He was close enough now that I could see the flecks of gray in the dark stubble on his jaw, the way his t-shirt clung to his chest and arms. He smelled of rain and wet soil. He gestured with his chin toward the shed. "Gates latched," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos of the storm. "Storm like this can knock a branch down. Best to be somewhere solid." He looked at me, his gaze direct and unreadable. "Under here with me." It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact and instruction. A quiet command. For a moment, I just stared. The world had shrunk to the space between us, the sound of the rain, the rumble of thunder, and this man I didn't know, offering me shelter. My carefully constructed solitude was being breached by a simple, practical invitation. My life of observation was demanding participation. I am moving before I've even decided to. My feet carry me down the 2 steps, my forgotten coffee mug still clutched in my hand. The rain is instantly cold, shocking, soaking my t-shirt and hair in seconds. He's already turned and is walking toward the shed. I follow, a step behind him, watching the way his boots splash in the newly formed puddles. He pulls the heavy wooden door open, and a wave of scent hits me. Cut grass, oil, damp earth, and something uniquely his. He steps inside and holds the door for me. I duck under his arm, the brief brush of my shoulder against his chest sending a jolt through my system that has nothing to do with the cold. He pulls the door almost closed, leaving just a crack of gray light. The roar of the storm is instantly muffled, replaced by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the tin roof. It's dark inside, the only light coming from that thin sliver and a single grimy window high on one wall. Shapes slowly emerge from the gloom. A large riding mower, shelves of tools, coiled hoses, bags of fertilizer. And him. He's standing near the center of the small space, a dark, solid silhouette against the pale light from the door. "Thanks," I finally managed to say, my voice sounding thin and unfamiliar. "No trouble." He ran a hand through his wet hair, slicking it back from his forehead. The gesture was simple, unconscious, but I watched the movement of his arm, the flex of muscle in his bicep. My mind was cataloging details with a frantic, desperate energy. The way a drop of water clung to his earlobe, the frayed edge of his jeans, the sheer, solid presence of him in this small, enclosed space. The silence I had craved for weeks was gone, replaced by a new kind of quiet. This one was alive. It was filled with the sound of our breathing and the storm raging just outside the thin walls. And it was terrifying. In the days that followed the storm, a new routine established itself. The watching didn't stop, but its quality changed. Before, he had been a distant figure, an abstract concept I could safely observe. Now he was Sam. I had learned his name in the shed, during a stilted conversation shouted over the drumming rain. Samuel, but everyone called him Sam. He learned my name, too. Julian. He'd said it once, a simple acknowledgement, and the sound of it in his low voice had felt strangely intimate. Now, when I watched him from my window, I was watching Sam, and I was acutely aware that he knew I was there. He didn't look at my cottage any more frequently than before, but when he did, it felt different. It was no longer a cursory glance at the landscape. There was a weight to it, a momentary pause in his work as his eyes swept over my windows. I'd feel the look like a physical touch and would instinctively pull back from the glass, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm. It felt like a game, a silent, slow-motion dance where neither of us had acknowledged the music. I was a terrible dancer. I started analyzing everything, every minute interaction, replaying it in my head until the memory was worn smooth. One morning, I was heading out to my car and he was nearby, using a trimmer along the edge of the stone walkway. He switched off the engine as I approached, the sudden silence deafening. "Morning, Julian," he said. "Morning, Sam." I felt my face flush, a ridiculous, adolescent blush. I was a grown man, for heaven's sake. He gestured with the trimmer toward a fallen branch near the base of the old oak, a casualty of the storm. Gonna get that cleared out today? It's not in your way, is it? No, not at all. I'm fine. My words came out too quickly. He just nodded, his eyes lingering on my face for a fraction of a second too long. Or maybe I imagined it. That was the problem. My mind had become an unreliable narrator, desperate to find meaning where there was none. He was just being polite, the diligent groundskeeper checking in with the tenant. But my brain seized on that fleeting moment of eye contact, the slight dip of his head, the way his lips had been pressed into a neutral line that could, if you squinted and held your breath, almost be the start of a smile. I spent the rest of the day dissecting that single, 30-second exchange. It was exhausting. The touches began a week later. They were nothing, really. So small and incidental that to anyone else, they would have been invisible, meaningless. But to me, they were seismic events. The first time, I was bringing in groceries, fumbling with 2 paper bags and my keys. I dropped the keys, and they skittered across the porch. Before I could even attempt to bend over without spilling everything, a hand was there, scooping them up. Got it, Sam said. He was right beside me, appearing so silently I hadn't even heard him approach. He placed the keys into my free hand, his calloused fingers brushing against my palm. The contact was brief, a whisper of skin on skin, but a current of heat shot up my arm. His skin was warm, rough. Mine was suddenly cold and clammy. Oh, thanks. I stammered, my carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. Careful, was all he said, his gaze dropping to the overloaded bags in my arms. He gave a small nod, and then was gone, heading back toward the mower he'd left idling on the lawn. I stood there on my porch, keys clutched in my hand, my palm tingling where he'd touched me. I could still feel the phantom weight of his fingers. I replayed the moment again and again. The way he had curled his fingers around the keys, the texture of his skin, the low timbre of his voice. It was just a neighborly gesture, a kind act. It meant nothing, and yet it meant everything. The second touch was more deliberate. I had bought a ridiculously large fern, an impulse purchase from the local nursery, and was trying to hang it from a hook on the porch awning. I was standing precariously on a wobbly kitchen chair, straining to lift the heavy pot. I knew, a comical sight. You're going to break your neck. His voice came from right behind me, and I yelped, wobbling dangerously. A large, steady hand landed squarely on the small of my back, holding me in place. The warmth of his palms soaked through my t-shirt, a solid, grounding pressure. My entire body went rigid. I am hyper-aware of everything. The scent of fresh-cut grass clinging to him. The solid wall of his chest so close behind me. The way my own breathing has hitched in my throat. This is not accidental. His hand is firmly planted on my back. It's a practical gesture, meant only to keep me from falling. But it feels like so much more. It feels like a brand. Here, he said, his voice a low rumble near my ear. Let me. He didn't wait for an answer. His other hand came up, easily taking the weight of the heavy pot from my grasp. His fingers brushed mine again, a longer, more sustained contact this time. I stumbled off the chair, my legs feeling like jelly, and turned to watch him. He didn't even bother with the chair. He just reached up, his arm extending effortlessly, and hooked the planter. The muscles in his back and shoulders shifted under his shirt with the movement. He was strong in a way that was utterly unselfconscious, a strength born from daily, physical work. He turned back to me, his hand dropping from my back, leaving a patch of warm, tingling skin in its wake. There, he said. Thank you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I overestimated my reach. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was the first one I'd seen up close, and it transformed his face, softening the stoic lines around his eyes and mouth. Happens, he looked at the fern, then back at me. Looks good. And then he was gone, walking away with that same unhurried stride, leaving me alone on the porch with my ridiculously large plant and a racing heart. I leaned against the doorframe, pressing my hand to where his had been, as if I could somehow preserve the warmth. These small moments were becoming the focal points of my day, of my week. I was living on scraps, on fleeting touches and half-smiles, and I was starving. My quiet, observant life had been invaded, and the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the anticipation of him. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a grand, dramatic event. It was quiet, mundane, and centered around a fallen tree branch. The same one Sam had mentioned after the storm. It was thicker than I had realized, a substantial limb from the ancient oak, and it lay sprawled across a section of the lawn that bordered my cottage. One afternoon, I heard the distinctive buzz of a chainsaw. I looked out the window and saw him there, methodically cutting the limb into manageable sections. On a whim, an impulse I couldn't explain, I pulled on my boots and went outside. I had no reason to, no purpose, but I found myself walking toward him, drawn by some invisible string. He cut the engine as I approached, pulling a pair of protective goggles up to rest on his forehead. He was sweating, a sheen of moisture on his temples and neck. His t-shirt was damp, clinging to his torso. "Need something?" he asked, his tone neutral. "No. I just thought I'd see if you needed a hand." The words sounded absurd as soon as they left my mouth. Me, in my clean jeans and soft hands, offering to help him with a chainsaw and a 10-foot tree limb. He looked me up and down, a slow, appraising glance. I expected him to laugh, or at least smile condescendingly. Instead, he just nodded toward the pile of logs he'd already cut. Could help me move these to the woodpile behind the main house. And so we worked. For the next hour, we fell into a surprisingly easy rhythm. He would finish cutting a section, and I would haul it, one at a time, to the neat stack of firewood behind the large stone house. The logs were heavy, awkward. The bark was rough against my skin, and my muscles, unused to this kind of labor, quickly began to ache. But I didn't care. There was something deeply satisfying about the simple, physical task, and about working alongside him. We didn't talk much. There was no need. The air was filled with the sounds of our work. The thud of wood on wood, the scuff of our boots on the grass, the sound of our breathing, slightly labored in the humid afternoon air. We were a team, a temporary, unspoken partnership. We were sharing a space, a task, a purpose. It felt more real than any conversation we'd had. When the last log was stacked, we stood for a moment by the woodpile, both of us breathing a little heavily. I wiped a bead of sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand, leaving a smear of dirt in its place. Sam reached out, his thumb coming up to my face. He gently wiped the dirt from my temple. His touch was firm, deliberate. His thumb was calloused and warm against my skin. He held it there for a beat too long, his eyes fixed on mine. The world seemed to stop. The air grew thick, charged. His gaze was intense, searching. I could see the dark ring around his irises, the tiny lines fanning out from the corners of his eyes. My breath caught in my chest. This was different from the other touches. This was not accidental. This was not practical. This was something else. This is it. This is the moment. My mind is screaming, a frantic, silent siren. Say something. Do something. But I am frozen, caught in the tractor beam of his gaze. I can feel the rough pad of his thumb against my skin, a single point of contact that has my entire nervous system on high alert. He dropped his hand, the spell breaking. He cleared his throat and looked away, toward the house. "Thanks for the help," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. "Didn't have to. It was nothing." I managed, my own voice sounding strained. We stood in an awkward silence for a moment, the comfortable rhythm of our shared work gone, replaced by this new, humming tension. I felt a desperate need to fill the quiet, to say something that would put us back on solid ground. Do you live around here?" I asked, cringing internally at how lame it sounded. He surprised me by answering. "I have a small apartment over the garage of the main house. Part of the job." Oh, I hadn't known that. I had pictured him driving off at the end of the day to some other life, a wife, a dog. But he was here. He was always here, just on the other side of the lawn. The knowledge settled in my stomach with a strange, heavy weight. He leaned against the woodpile, crossing his arms over his chest. The posture was casual, but there was a watchfulness in his eyes. "You're from the city, right? Big change, coming out here." It was the first time he'd asked me a personal question, the first time he'd shown any curiosity about my life beyond the boundaries of this property. It felt like a door creaking open. "Yeah, it is." I found myself wanting to tell him, wanting to explain the crushing weight of my old life, the noise, the loneliness that is somehow worse when you're surrounded by millions of people. But I didn't know how. So I just said, I needed the quiet. He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. Some people can't stand it. The quiet. Makes them nervous. They need the noise to drown everything out. He looked at me then, a long, steady look. Doesn't seem to bother you. No, I said softly. It doesn't. It was a moment of unexpected softness, of introspection. This quiet, capable man was revealing a sliver of his inner world, a perception that went beyond lawns and rose bushes. He saw me. He saw that the quiet wasn't something I was enduring, but something I had sought out. He understood something about me without my having to say a word. It was a form of intimacy that was more potent than any physical touch. We stood there for another minute, wrapped in a comfortable silence that felt entirely new. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't tense. It was full. It was a shared understanding. The barriers between us, the ones I had so carefully maintained, were beginning to crumble. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was hopeful. The tipping point arrived in the form of a cherry pie. Mrs. Gable, the estate owner's sister and a woman whose nosiness was the stuff of local legend, appeared on my porch one Tuesday morning. She was a bird-like woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She held out a pie, its lattice crust glistening with sugar. "Just a little welcome to the neighborhood," she chirped, her gaze sweeping past me to assess the interior of my cottage. "Though you've been here a few weeks now, haven't you, dear? So quiet. We hardly know you're here." "Thank you. That's very kind," I said, taking the warm dish. Her eyes landed on the fern, the one Sam had helped me hang. "Oh, what a lovely plant. You have a green thumb." She paused, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Or perhaps you've had some help. I see Samuel has been keeping the grounds around your cottage particularly tidy." The implication was clear, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. My face grew hot. "He's very good at his job," I said, my voice tight. "Oh, the best," she agreed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "A very capable man. So strong. It's good you have him around, a single fellow like you. All sorts of things can go wrong in an old place like this." The conversation was a minefield. Every word was loaded, every pause significant. She was fishing, and I was doing my best not to take the bait. After a few more minutes of excruciatingly pleasant small talk, she finally departed, leaving me on the porch with the pie and a profound sense of unease. Her words echoed in my head. A single fellow like you. She had seen something, or she suspected something, and her casual, gossipy probing felt like a spotlight. Later that day, I saw Sam near the rose bushes that flanked my porch. I knew I had to say something, to warn him, or to gauge his reaction. My hands felt clammy as I stepped outside, a slice of the pie on a plate. It felt like a flimsy excuse, a prop in a play I hadn't rehearsed. "Pie," I offered, holding it out. He stopped his work, pulling off his thick leather gloves. He looked at the pie, then at me. "Mrs. Gable." I nodded. The welcome wagon finally rolled in. He took the plate, a small, wry smile on his face. "Her pies are better than her gossip." But only just, he took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. It was clear he knew exactly what a visit from Mrs. Gable entailed. This was the moment, the loaded interaction. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I leaned against the porch railing, trying to appear casual. She mentioned you." Sam kept his eyes on the pie, taking another bite. "I'm sure she did. She said you've been keeping my part of the grounds particularly tidy." I forced the words out, my voice sounding unnaturally high. He finished the pie in 2 more bites and handed the empty plate back to me. He held my gaze, his expression unreadable, a mask of calm neutrality. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy with unspoken words. He was waiting. He was testing me, waiting to see what I would say, how I would react. The subtext of the moment was deafening. "She thinks there's something between us. What do you think, Julian?" My courage failed me. I couldn't meet the challenge in his eyes. I looked away, down at the plate in my hands. "I just told her you were good at your job," I mumbled. I risked a glance back up at him. A flicker of something crossed his face. Disappointment? I couldn't be sure. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. He just nodded, his expression once again stoic, unreadable. "I am," he said quietly. He pulled his gloves back on. "Enjoy the pie." He turned and went back to his roses, the snip of his shears sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. I retreated back into my cottage, my cheeks burning with a shame I couldn't quite name. I had been given an opening, a chance to acknowledge the crackling energy between us, and I had slammed the door shut. I had retreated back behind my glass wall, back to the safety of observation. I had failed the test. The rest of the week was filled with a strained silence. We went back to our old ways, him a figure on the lawn, me a shadow in the window. But the dynamic had shifted. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a tense, aching void. I had shown him my fear, and now it was the only thing left between us. The second storm came a week later. It was different from the first, less violent but more melancholic. A steady, soaking rain began in the late afternoon and continued into the evening, a persistent drumming on the roof that matched the dreary rhythm of my thoughts. I had spent days replaying my conversation with Sam, kicking myself for my cowardice. I was convinced I had ruined whatever fragile, unspoken thing had been growing between us. He had been polite when we crossed paths, but distant. The brief moments of eye contact, the small smiles, they were gone. Around 9 o'clock, the lights flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the cottage into a sudden, profound darkness. I let out a frustrated sigh. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a blinding beacon in the blackness, and searched for the candles I knew were in a kitchen drawer. As I was lighting the first one, its small flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, there was a knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat. It had to be him. I opened the door to find Sam standing on the porch, a large flashlight in one hand, the rain dripping from his hair and the brim of his jacket. "Power's out in the main house, too," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Just wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine. Just getting some candles lit." My voice was shaky. The sight of him here, now, felt like a reprieve, a second chance. He peered past me into the dark room, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "You have a flashlight?" "I think so. Somewhere." "Stay put." He turned and disappeared from the porch, jogging through the rain. A minute later, he was back with another flashlight and a handful of extra batteries. He stepped inside, bringing the scent of rain and damp earth with him, filling the small space with his presence. He handed me the light. "Thanks," I said, my fingers brushing his as I took it. The familiar jolt went through me, but this time it was laced with a desperate ache. We stood in the entryway, the silence stretching between us, punctuated only by the rain and the faint crackle of the candle flame. The air was thick with everything we hadn't said. The tension was a living thing, a third person in the room with us. "This is it. I can't do it again. I can't let this moment pass. I have to say something." The fear is a cold knot in my stomach, but the thought of him walking out that door and back into that strange silence is worse. "Sam," I started, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, his expression serious, waiting. The words just tumbled out, a raw, clumsy confession. "I'm sorry. About the other day. With Mrs. Gable." He didn't say anything, just watched me, his gaze steady. I panicked. I continued, the words gaining momentum. I'm not used to this. To anyone. I've been hiding for a long time. In the city, here. It's just easier." I took a shaky breath. "And then you were just kind to me. And I didn't know what to do with it." "With you," my voice broke on the last word. He took a step closer. We were only inches apart now. He reached out, not to touch me, but to take the flashlight from my trembling hand, setting it on the small table beside the door. He still hadn't spoken. He was just looking at me, his eyes searching my face in the dim light. And then I said it, the thing I hadn't even let myself think, the truth that had been hiding behind all my observations and analyses. "I think about you. All the time." It was out. The most vulnerable I had ever been, laid bare in the flickering candlelight of my tiny cottage. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the rejection, for the polite, awkward retreat. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt his hands, warm and calloused, come up to cup my face. My eyes snapped open. He was right there, his expression transformed by a raw, unguarded tenderness that stole my breath. He searched my eyes for a second longer, as if asking a final, silent question. And then he leaned in and kissed me. It was not a rushed or hungry kiss. It was slow, deliberate, a question and an answer all in one. His lips were soft, firm, tasting faintly of rain. His stubble was rough against my skin. It was a kiss of profound reassurance, a quiet confirmation of everything that had been simmering between us. I melted into it, my hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath my palms. He deepened the kiss, a low sound rumbling in his chest, and I felt weeks of tension, of yearning and fear, drain out of me, replaced by a dizzying, overwhelming relief. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, his hands still cradling my face. We were both breathing heavily. His eyes were dark, intense. "Took you long enough, Julian," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. A hint of his wry smile was back, but it was gentle, without any edge. I let out a shaky laugh, a sound that was half-sob. "I'm not very brave." "You are now," he said softly. He laced the fingers of one of his hands with mine, his grip firm and warm. The simple gesture was an anchor, a promise. It was the first truly reciprocal moment between us, a connection finally made, not through observation or analysis, but through a shared, terrifying, beautiful honesty. In the dark, with the storm raging outside, it felt like the whole world had fallen away, leaving just the two of us, finally speaking the same language. I woke to the unfamiliar silence of a world without rain. The persistent drumming on the roof was gone, replaced by the gentle dripping of water from the eaves and the tentative chirping of early morning birds. For a moment, I was disoriented, my mind still foggy with sleep. Then the memory of the night before rushed back in a dizzying, heart-stopping wave. The confession. The kiss. Sam. My eyes snapped open. I was in my own bed. Alone. A cold dread washed over me, immediate and sickening. He was gone. I sat up, my heart pounding a frantic, anxious rhythm against my ribs. The cottage was filled with the pale gray light of dawn. I looked around the room, searching for any sign that he had been there, that it hadn't been some vivid, desperate dream. His jacket wasn't on the chair. The flashlight he'd brought was gone from the entryway table. He left. He regretted it. The thought was a physical blow, winding me. I had pushed too hard, said too much. I had shattered the delicate, unspoken thing between us with my clumsy, needy confession, and he had fled. The familiar shame I had felt after the conversation about Mrs. Gable returned, but this time it was 100 times worse. I had made myself vulnerable, and he had walked away. I buried my face in my hands, a wave of humiliation and despair washing over me. I was an idiot, a lonely, hopeful idiot. I stayed in bed for a long time, listening to the house settle around me. The power was still out. The silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was mocking. It was the sound of my own solitude, a state I had apparently been destined to return to. I finally forced myself out of bed, pulling on a sweatshirt against the morning chill. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. I couldn't bear to see him out there on the lawn, moving with that same familiar purpose, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't completely upended my world and then simply vanished. I shuffled into the kitchen, my mind a numb buzz of self-recrimination. I would have to see him eventually. We lived on the same small patch of earth. How would I face him? Should I pretend it never happened? The thought was unbearable. The honesty of that kiss, the feeling of his hands on my face, I couldn't just erase it. Just as I was resigning myself to a future of excruciatingly awkward encounters, there was a soft knock on the door. Not the front door, but the small kitchen door that led out to the back patio. My blood ran cold. I froze, my hand hovering over the cold stovetop. It had to be him. I didn't want to answer. I wanted to curl up and disappear. But my feet, betraying my fear, carried me to the door. I took a deep, shaky breath and pulled it open. Sam was standing there. He was wearing a clean, dry shirt, and his hair was damp, as if from a recent shower. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was soft, his eyes gentle. In one hand, he held a large, steaming travel mug. In the other, a smaller ceramic one that I recognized as my own. He held out my mug to me. "Power's still out," he said, his voice low and calm. "I have a gas stove in my place. Figured you might need this." I stared at the mug, then at his face. It was coffee. He had made me coffee. It was such a simple, domestic gesture, so profoundly normal, that it completely short-circuited my anxiety. This was not the action of a man who regretted what had happened. This was not the behavior of someone who was fleeing. I took the mug, my fingers brushing his. The warmth of the ceramic seeped into my cold hands. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice thick. "I know," he said simply. He didn't leave. He just stood there in my doorway, holding his own mug, waiting. He was giving me space, letting me process. It was a quiet, profound act of reassurance. He wasn't going to talk it to death. He was just going to be here. He was going to stay. I woke up and you were gone. I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. I thought. He understood immediately. A flicker of something, regret, crossed his face. I'm sorry. I didn't want to wake you. You were sleeping so soundly. He took a small step closer, into the kitchen. I didn't run, Julian. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made me dizzy. I leaned against the doorframe, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and hot, and it tasted like hope. He had used my name again. I didn't run, Julian. The quiet declaration was everything I needed to hear. It was a promise. It was the second part of the conversation we'd started with a kiss. We stood there for a moment, drinking our coffee in a silence that was once again comfortable, easy. The awkwardness of the morning had evaporated, burned away by a simple, kind gesture. Our return to routine, to the simple act of a morning coffee, wasn't a retreat to how things were. It was the test. It was seeing if what happened in the dark, during a storm, could survive the clear, honest light of day. And as I looked at him, standing so solid and real in my kitchen, I knew that it could. It already had. The days that followed were a quiet navigation of a new, uncharted territory. Nothing was said explicitly. There was no grand discussion, no defining of terms. We didn't need it. The commitment was made in small, unspoken ways. It was in the way he started leaving a second mug of coffee on my porch railing every morning before he started his rounds. It was in the way I started leaving my kitchen door unlocked. He would join me for lunch sometimes, sitting on my porch steps while I sat in the chair above him. We'd eat in a comfortable silence, sharing an apple or a bag of chips. Our conversations were simple, easy. He told me about the gardens, about the challenges of keeping a century-old estate from being reclaimed by nature. He pointed out the different birds that visited the feeders, naming each one. I told him about my design work, about the frustrating clients and the small creative victories. I showed him my sketches, something I rarely did with anyone. He would look at them with a quiet, serious concentration, his finger tracing a line I had drawn, his touch sending a familiar spark through the paper and into me. Our relationship was built in these quiet moments, these shared spaces. The physical intimacy grew just as slowly, just as organically. It was a hand on my back as we walked. It was his fingers lacing with mine as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. It was the first time he stayed the night, after a long, quiet dinner where we talked for hours. There was no frantic urgency. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a learning of each other's rhythms and textures. Waking up with him beside me, his arm draped over my waist, his slow, steady breathing a comforting presence in the quiet room, felt more right than anything I had ever known. It felt like coming home. We made a conscious choice, not with words, but with actions. The choice was in every cup of coffee, every shared meal, every quiet evening that bled into a shared morning. We were building something real, brick by brick, in the shelter of the quiet life I had once thought was a sign of my own isolation. I realized now that it wasn't isolation I had been seeking. It was peace. It was a space cleared of all the noise so I could finally hear what my own heart was trying to say. One evening, about a month after the first storm, we were sitting on the porch. A comfortable silence had settled between us as we watched the fireflies begin to flicker in the deepening twilight. The air was cool and smelled of honeysuckle and damp earth. Sam's shoulder was pressed against mine, a solid, comforting weight. I leaned my head against him, closing my eyes. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low murmur beside my ear. I thought for a moment, replaying the last few months in my head. The lonely man watching the world from behind a window. The terror and thrill of that first storm. The agonizing, exhilarating slowness of our coming together. The feeling of his hand in mine. "I'm thinking about the silence," I said softly. "I came here looking for it. I thought it was what I wanted, to be alone in it." I opened my eyes and looked at him. His face was turned toward me, his expression soft in the fading light. But I was wrong. The silence was just empty. "This," I said, gesturing to the quiet world around us, to the space between us, "this isn't empty. This is peaceful." He didn't say anything. He just reached up and gently tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers warm against my skin. The gesture was full of a quiet, profound tenderness. It was an answer more eloquent than any words could ever be. I had spent so much of my life feeling like an observer, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. I had built walls of silence and solitude around myself, believing they were for my own protection. But Sam hadn't broken those walls down. He had simply opened the gate and waited for me to walk through. He had shown me that true quiet wasn't about the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. It was the feeling of being known, of being safe. It was the steady beat of his heart against my palm in a dark cottage during a storm. It was the taste of coffee on a hopeful morning. It was the solid weight of his shoulder against mine as night settled over the world. I was no longer watching my life from behind a window. I was in it. I was home.